Everyone, before I begin, I would like to plug this podcast that I recently made an appearance on, that being Mad Sounds by Spin It Reviews, and you can go check the link in the description and listen to it now. Hello everybody, welcome to the Wonky Angle, where I talk about electronic music, both new and old. And today I'm talking about the new album from Infected Mushroom, Return to the Sauce. Infected Mushroom are a psytrance duo from Israel, whose actual names I'm not even going to try to pronounce. These are some pretty popular and historically significant guys that I've known about for a long time, but never actually bothered to delve into in any capacity until now. And there's one big reason for that, and it's that this genre, psytrance, go-trance, it tends to tire me out pretty quickly. My experience in this genre is limited to Juno Reactor, Solar Fields, Spangle, and Astral Projection. And while I like all those guys a lot, I need to be in a certain mood to enjoy their stuff. Well, Solar Fields is a bit more of an exception, as he only has 2 trance albums, and his work is mostly more ambient-centric otherwise. But regardless, this is a genre that I prefer in short bursts. This isn't as big a problem with Spangle, but it is, especially in the case of Astral Projection and early Juno Reactor, like Transmissions and Beyond the Infinite, as they're much more intense, and my personal preferences tend towards more down-tempo and ambient stuff. So, you can imagine my feelings when I look at this band's back catalog, and it turns out this new one is their 11th to date, and their song and album lengths tend to go pretty long as well, and on top of that, they also don't seem to be the kind of band that will ever give listeners like me a break. Maybe even more intense than Juno Reactor in some areas. I was immediately intimidated, and even thought about just skipping some of these albums and only listening to 2 or 3 of them in the interest of time. But I decided against that, pressed on regardless. Even with the knowledge, worst case scenario, I might need SFTG pumped into my ears for a day or 2 to recover afterwards. Why should I let my listening style stop me from educating myself on a well-established electronic act from the 90s? From what I can tell, though, they at least seem to be the kind of band that never makes the same album twice. To the point where, anytime they try something new, every album since I Am the Supervisor has gotten waves of people hating them. Yeah, by the way, I have not seen a band with this little of a consensus, opinion-wise, in a while. Some people love them and everything they do, some people only like certain albums of theirs, and some people just don't like them at all. Comforting. I'm sure the comment section of this video is going to be wonderful. Well, regardless, I jumped right in, and here's my thoughts on their discography so far. Well, it's fairly similar to Astral Projection stuff. A bit darker. Not exactly reinventing the wheel here. Everything just kind of runs together for me. I mean, that's nothing new for the genre, but it was alright. So here they added in elements of classical music, as the title implies. I think it turned out a more memorable and enjoyable experience overall, getting some Jean-Michel Jarre vibes in some areas, and I like that. Basically more of the same kind of stuff on their first album, bit more variety than on there. It's pretty good for the most part, but the real highlight is the last track, Dancing with Gaddafi, which I know the guitar loop at the beginning from those old Light Force Flash games that turned me onto Aphex Twin. Funny how that works out. Okay, so this one's a double album, with the first half, the trance side, being more of the same kind of stuff they'd done before, but the second half, the other side, is much more diverse and memorable, with basically no trance at all. More like some lighthearted and quirky down-tempo album. Definitely some cool stuff here. Brought in quite a bit of rock and glitch elements on this one, which came into play in most of their subsequent releases. Pretty good. And this one's a bit more commercial focused, not to the point of sounding uncomfortable or anything. Quite a bit on variety on here too. I just don't really care for the album cover. I feel like this is kind of a dig on the alternate cover to Hybrid's Wide Angle, except creepy on purpose. Okay, more pop and rock elements here, almost treading into pendulum territory in some parts. It's not bad, but it's nothing stellar either. One guy on Twitter asked me what I thought about the track Project 100. That's one of the better ones on here. Okay, by this point there is no trance here at all. it's all just glitch and dubstep. Like, this fact alone doesn't bother me, but the album itself is just kinda average for me. Also, the track You Are So Fucked is exceptionally stupid. Doesn't quite sound like Zed, doesn't quite sound like Knife Party, it's more kinda like... Oh. Okay, I think I'm starting to get why this seems to be the I Am album with the most hate. Granted, I like Skrillex and I thought this album was fun enough, but there's like no resemblance to their original sound by this point, and I won't be blaming anyone who says they thought this was a dud. Okay, this is more of the same down-tempo weirdness found on the second half of Converting Vegetarians, which makes sense given the title. I think I prefer the original, as there was twice as much of it, but this was pretty fun too. And I recommend it. Which brings us to here. So, Infected Mushroom's back catalog surprisingly turned out not to be the chore to get through I was expecting it to be. I mean, it certainly wasn't all great or anything. Heck, I think I'd only consider Converting Vegetarians for a rating in the 8 range right now. Granted, I've only listened to these albums for the first time over the past 3 days or so, and I have no idea how well they would stand up to repeat listens, nor do I have anything resembling nostalgia for any of these tracks aside from the first 15 seconds of Dancing with Gaddafi. But regardless, while there's nothing I feel like I can say I loved from them right now, I also can't say I thought any of their stuff was outright bad. I think bands like Astral Projection are better at making straight, no-nonsense trance music. The one thing I can definitely respect about these guys is that they're always willing to take risks and try new things with no regards to what their typical audience might think. And even their dubstep stuff, while not as good as their trance stuff, is not bad at all. Regardless of how many people try to convince me otherwise, I don't consider Skrillex and modern dubstep to be the worst thing ever to happen to music. But that's a different conversation for a different day, because this latest album, Return to the Sauce, is not dubstep. In fact, I'll just cut to the chase and tell you that this album is Infected Mushroom's first attempt in a really long time to make actual trance music. Yeah. I've seen people who only liked their first 3 albums finally admit they liked this one as well, and I can confirm this is the closest they've come to the sound of those first 3 since those first 3. Now the question is, what do I think of it? Basically, my thoughts on this album somewhat mirror my thoughts on Infected Mushroom's back catalog as a whole. No huge standouts, but nothing remotely bad either. I don't know if any of these songs are likely to make the same impact as some of those early singles like Bust a Move or Dancing with Gaddafi, but it is very solid, and old school trance fans should have their fill with this stuff. Granted, it's not like a straight rehash of The Gathering or anything. There is still some variation here. Tracks have different tempos, there's multiple songs that have a bouncy 6-on-the-floor beat, and yeah, a little bit of that Converting Vegetarians weirdness shows up every now and then. They still like using their guitars and still use them, although not to the extent to, say, Legend of the Black Shawarma. And they still do their glitchy stutter edits every now and then. But of course, given my love for BT, I have no problem with this. And there are kinda sorta pop hooks here every now and then too, most notably on the track Groove Attack, which was definitely one of my personal favorites. So if you're some trance purist who wants them to just follow those old school formulas to the letter, actually, I'm not sure why you're even watching at this point, but of course they're not going to do that the whole time. But the bigger surprise is that they do it on a couple of tracks. Like, they broke up the old school synth tones, and for the first time in what feels like ages, they use those old school tones on basically every song. And they're like actual straightforward trance songs on here. Like their remix of Xerox's Gravity Waves, probably the most straightforward trance track on here, as well as Manipulator, the title track, Milosh, and to a lesser extent the Demons of Pain remix. Flamingo, too, is also kinda like their attempt at making another Bust a Move. I think that turned out fairly well. The 10-minute Milosh utilizes its length pretty well and has some cool progression. Nutmeg has its fair share of interesting moments that I quite enjoyed, most notably these cool synth bell melodies around the halfway mark, and the almost kinda hybrid-esque sections following not long after. And Liquid Smoke has a nice piano intro that I liked, calling back to the Converting Vegetarians albums, even if it kind of devolves into the usual unrelated weirdness right after that. So, overall, I can't give this album a recommendation. I think it's one of Infected Mushroom's best albums in a while, and while you can admittedly take my opinion with a grain of salt there, as right now this is the only Infected Mushroom album I've listened to more than once, I definitely enjoyed this. I like that they finally called back to their old sound after such a long time of random experimentations and fan alienations. I personally don't really ask for much out of Infected Mushroom besides just give me something fun, and they delivered in that regard. I'd say it's worth checking out. I'm overall feeling a 7.5 out of 10. But of course, this is just my opinion. You can feel free to disagree with it, but I'd like to hear your thoughts, so leave the comments in the comment thing down there. But yeah, that's pretty much it. That's all for today. See you next time.